Okay. Welcome back. Good evening, and thank you for hanging around for the last session today. You're the brave and the strong here at the end of the day. In this session, role-based management of user groups and permissions in SharePoint, we're going to look at the security model that SharePoint provides and ensure that we answer some of the fundamentals of security in SharePoint, some of the common questions and concerns that enterprises have about managing users, groups, and permissions in SharePoint. And then we're going to build up to a really, I think, useful approach to managing security in a role-based model with SharePoint, which is to actually move some of the role-based management into Active Directory and allow groups to synchronize between Active Directory and SharePoint. So we're going to see a number of out-of-box features, and we're also going to go way out of the box to extend the capabilities of SharePoint. For those of you who were not in my previous sessions, I'll give you a very quick overview of who I am. I think most of you were at least one of my previous sessions. My name is Dan Holm. I'm a 5-year SharePoint MVP and a MVP in directory services before that. So my area of expertise really falls into both the core Windows stack, including Active Directory and SharePoint. So this is a good session to be able to bring some of my experience to you. I'm the Chief SharePoint Evangelist for AvePoint, and I am my day job is to travel the world and work with customers to ensure that they are being successful with SharePoint. So I do want to ensure that you also are successful with SharePoint, and whether it's through this session, through questions after this session, or email conversations after today, I definitely want to help ensure that you're moving forward and scaling your SharePoint implementation to meet the needs of your business. When I'm not traveling, I'm based in Maui, Hawaii. This is what I see when I look out my office, and this is what I see on weekends. So it's a nice place to live, and I certainly hope that you are able to come join and visit in Maui someday. It's well worth the long flight there. And I also spend time as a consultant working with large organizations, including NBC Television, for whom we are now working on preparing for the broadcast of the London Olympic Games this summer. Last but not least, I'm an author. I wrote the training kit for SharePoint 2010. And in the context of this conversation, another very good resource that I wrote with Microsoft several years ago is the Windows Administration Resource Kit. The Windows Administration Resource Kit from Microsoft Press has a really solid reference on role-based management in Active Directory, which we will now extend into SharePoint as well. And then my email address and Twitter handle are on the slides. Do please follow me on Twitter, and feel free to email me if you've got questions. So without further ado, let's take a look at some of the things we're going to dive in today. As I mentioned, we're going to start with the fundamental concepts of security in SharePoint, looking at inheritance and explicit permissions, evaluating effective permissions, security trimming, permission levels, web application policy, information management policies, and auditing, and then we're going to go on to the role-based management piece as well. So in SharePoint, the security model is fairly simple, which is you can assign permissions to users in groups. The groups, when you define them, are actually defined at the site collection level, but it can be given permissions at any level of the SharePoint architecture below that. So you can assign permissions to a top-level site, to a sub-site, to a library, to a list, to a folder, even down to the granular item level. You can assign permissions to a group or even to a user. But in SharePoint, very much like on file servers and other scenarios, we should be assigning permissions to groups rather than to individual users in most scenarios. Because today, you may have only one accountant who needs permission to the budget. But it may be in a year, you have 3 accountants. And if you assign permissions to a group today, even though there's only one user in that group, that allows you to scale and manage your growth in more effective ways. So the basic model is very much like a file server where we can apply permissions at a high level and allow those permissions to be inherited through our environment. So let's jump up into a virtual machine and pull up some sites. Whoops. And I need my glasses here. So we're going to go to our consulting team site. Actually, we'll go to marketing here. let it connect for a moment. Looks like my websites fell asleep as I was moving from the speaker room to here. Here we go. So we have our marketing team site, and if we go into site permissions, which is where we manage security for the site as a whole, we can see that there are certain groups that are created by default: members, owners, and visitors. And so these are SharePoint groups that can then be defined permissions at particular levels. And by default, these groups are assigned contribute permission, full control, and read. So members gives us contribute, visitors gives us read, and owners gives us full control. So those are called the default associated groups in SharePoint. And when you create a site collection in the user interface, those are created for you automatically. Now the permissions that have been assigned at this top level now are inherited by everything below this, by sub-sites, by lists, and by libraries. So if we go to our shared documents folder, and let's go ahead and even add a subfolder to it. For the new product. When we look at the permissions for that new object, it tells us very clearly that it is, in fact, inheriting permissions from its parent. So all of the permissions that we see here are simply a report of what's coming from the parent. If we want to assign explicit permissions to this object, we can click Stop Inheriting Permissions. It gives us a warning that we are going to create explicit or unique permissions on this library. And it immediately copies what were inherited permissions to be the initial explicit permissions on this object. So we now have the same groups with the same permissions, but now we can take permissions away. Perhaps we don't want visitors to the marketing site to have access to this new product folder, for example. We can select that and we can remove user permissions. Perhaps we need our sales managers to have access to this folder. We can grant permissions and assign permissions to a user or group. Whoops. That must have been deleted from Active Directory. We'll just do sales. And we can assign permissions, and we pick from a list of what are called permission levels that include, again, contribute and read and full control. We'll go ahead and give contribute permission. And we've now assigned some explicit permissions. Now, there is a very big difference between what happens in a file server and in a SharePoint environment. In a file server, when you go down to a file, that file has a combination of the inherited permissions that come down and the explicit permissions that are attached to it. In SharePoint, you either have inherited or explicit, not a combination of both. So we only have explicit permissions. It doesn't matter what's assigned anywhere higher. This defines the access to URLs below this location. And so it's generally better to try to manage permissions at a high level in your architecture and allow inheritance to drop those permissions down versus breaking inheritance. But there are, of course, business scenarios that do require you to break inheritance at some level. Now, if you start wondering who has permission to what, SharePoint 2010 makes it very easy for you to check permissions, so we can display the permissions of a specific user. Let me look at a user named Sean. And, he has no permissions, so let's try, I'm going to cheat and look who's in that group. I can't remember who was in the group. April. So now we can see that April has several permissions here. She has full control, which actually is a mistake. I did that at the top of the site collection and forgot to point that out to you. So that's coming at the site collection level. But we can also see that here she has contribute permission by being a member of the sales group. So not only does it tell us what permission she has, but tells us why she has that permission. So if that permission is incorrect, we can go back and figure out exactly how she was given that permission. So that's a nice little feature as far as being able to evaluate those permissions. And if we ever want to reestablish inheritance, all we have to do is click the Inherit Permissions button, and that will remove our explicit permissions and reapply the inherited permissions. So it's a fairly simple model there for us to be able to configure permissions, allow inheritance, break inheritance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And let me make sure I've told you everything I wanted to tell you. The one last point that's worth mentioning is in a file server, if a user is going to go down to a file, they actually have to have a permission called traverse folder. You might not know that because by default, every user has a user right on Windows file servers for traverse folders. So unless you've removed that right, you would never have had to give them explicit permission to traverse folders. But in effect, a user has to be able to go down through the path to get to the specific file they're trying to get to. That's very different in SharePoint. In SharePoint, a user is requesting a specific item. It's a URL. So they're not going through anything. They're going directly to a URL. And it is only the permissions on that URL that matter. So there's no need to have any kind of traverse permissions down. It's only the permissions on that one URI. Okay. So that's the inheritance model. Any questions at this point on the inheritance model? Okay. So everything in SharePoint that is that has permissions associated with it is security trimmed. And security trimmed simply means that a user will not see something if they don't have permission to it. And that's a big benefit of SharePoint over file servers. For in my many years working with file servers, probably the most common question I get is, how do I hide users, how do I keep users from seeing what they don't have permission to? And it's very difficult in file server scenarios. It's not impossible, but it can become difficult. In SharePoint, it's quite easy. SharePoint automatically hides any item that you don't have permission to, so that's a good thing. Now, that is regardless of how you show that information. So let's go back into this library here, and let's see where we left off with permissions here. So we know who has permissions to these things, and if a user who isn't in one of those groups comes into this library and they don't have permission to that folder, they simply won't see it. Now remember that you can actually expose libraries in web parts. So let me show something that might happen in a sort of common team site, and that is the shared documents document library might be displayed on the home page of the team site. Again, if a user comes to this page, they won't see the new product folder if they don't have permission to it, which is great. But there's a challenge, and that is with indexing. If this page is being indexed, the tool that indexes this page is the crawl service. And the crawl service uses an account that has permission to everything. So the indexer will index this page almost as if it's reading the full text of the page, and it will capture the name of the folder, new product. That means when a user does a search for the word new product, they will actually see this page in the search results as long as they have permission to the page, even if they don't have permission to the folder. Does that make sense? It's a very funky potential challenge. And that becomes a problem if maybe what's in that library is something like this. A new folder called Who We Are Going to Fire Next Week. And all of a sudden, someone searching for that kind of thing sees that there's going to be a layoff next week, and all kinds of problems happen. So the idea is that even if a user doesn't have permission to a folder and wouldn't see it here, they might actually see it in search results, depending on how things are set up. That would be a potential problem. So Microsoft responded to that by going to the most secure model, which is that if you break inheritance anywhere in a site collection, then ASPX pages are not indexed. They're excluded from the index entirely. So because we have broken inheritance in this site collection, in this case on the folder, but anywhere in the site collection, default.aspx won't be indexed, which means that content editor web parts and other things that people put on that page that they might think should be indexed won't be, because the whole page is being skipped. So that's was Microsoft's way of ensuring that information didn't leak out through search. Does that make sense? All right. Now, if you have questions about that, I can explain it more after the session. But there is a solution to that. So what we're talking about here is described on the slide, And that is, you can go back in and cause Indexer to include ASPX content as long as you're confident that you're not leaking information potentially. So you can reverse this behavior by going into site settings and turning on indexing. Let me show you where that is. Under site settings, search and offline availability. This is the option that we're talking about here. Do not index web parts, any web parts, on this page if there are inherited permissions. So we can choose to turn that back on and index all web parts on this site. That makes sense? Questions? Okay, so that's a very funky little thing, but I've definitely had customers say, we're not getting this page on our search results, even though we're searching for the word welcome, we don't see that. Well, you wouldn't, because it's not getting indexed. Now, the permissions that we're dealing with, contribute, full control, read, those are in SharePoint language called permission levels. And a permission level is a collection of very small permissions that together enable a specific action to take place. So if we go into our site settings, or let's go to our site permissions here, and go to permission levels, we see that by default, this team site has the following permission levels: contribute, read, full control, design, which has a few additional things. And if we open up one of those permission levels, like contribute, we see all of the granular permissions on the right-hand side, all of the granular permissions that make up contribute. So contribute is a bundle of permissions called a permission level. Now, the default permission levels are okay. They cover some of the major scenarios of read-only, full control, but contribute is only one collaboration scenario. Contribute means you can add, edit, and delete items. In some collaboration scenarios, you might want users to be able to add things but not edit them. In other words, you can drop something in, but once it's there, it has to stay the same way. You might have a situation where you want users to be able to add and edit things but not delete each other's things. So there might be reasons why you would want different permission levels in an environment. And certainly, contribute without delete is a fairly common permission level. To create a permission level, you can do it two ways. You can start with a copy of an existing permission level. So we can take contribute, we can copy it, and that creates a new permission level with the same permissions. We'll call it contribute without delete. And then we can simply remove the one permission we don't want, delete items. So one way to create a new permission level is to just copy and then modify an existing permission level. The other way is to start from scratch, from a blank permission template. So we could choose add a permission level, and then we get to select the permissions that we do want. Now, here's another scenario that's very commonly needed for permission levels, particularly with collaboration. In a document library, you know that users can check out documents. And once a user checks out a document, nobody else can make changes until that user checks the document in. What happens if Dan checks out a document tomorrow afternoon and then goes on holiday next week for a week and someone needs to make a change to that document? Well, for another user to make a change, an administrator is going to have to get involved to override the checkout and to check in the document without Dan being there. That is a permission called override checkout. Administrators have it by default because it's part of full control. But many organizations want to delegate that so that the help desk doesn't have to be involved with that sort of task. And so you can create a permission level that allows maybe managers to check in documents on behalf of their users. You can create a permission level for that one specific task and then grant that task to appropriate groups in your environment. So let's create a permission level called Manage Checkout. That'll just the name. And it's a good idea to put in a description. Allows a user to override checkout and discard checkout. And then we can find the permission we need, which in this case is only one permission. It is override checkout. Now when we click that, you'll notice a couple of other checkboxes also get selected. SharePoint automatically checked view items. So it knows that if a user wants to override a checkout, they have to see the item. So it gives appropriate permissions for the task that you're selecting. But that is a least privilege implementation of override checkout. And now we click OK, or create, I should say. And we now have that permission level for manage checkout. Now all we have to do is decide who we want to manage checkout and to what scope. We might want a certain set of users to manage checkout only for a specific library. Or maybe, since this is the marketing team site, we'll just let the marketing managers override checkout for any library in the site. So we can apply the permission all the way up at the site to the marketing managers. So now we can go back to our permissions. This is at the site level, site permissions. And we can grant permissions to our marketing managers. Hopefully that group exists. Let's create it. Oh, let's use senior managers. That's good. That works. And we can then assign the specific permission level, the specific permission level that we just created, manage checkout. Again, this permission level is being assigned to a group at the top of our site collection, or at the top of our site, I should say, so all of the libraries within the site will now inherit that permission. So that's what permission levels are all about, and these have to be managed by site collection administrators. You have to be a site collection administrator to define a permission level. So in the slide deck, I've got a couple of examples here of what I've just shown you, including override checkout. And I think contribute without delete is also in there, just it's a hidden slide. Okay. Any questions on permission levels? Alrighty. Notice in the SharePoint permission model, there is no deny at the site level and below. All the permissions are allow. Now, in file servers, you were able to deny permissions, and remember how it worked. A user got all of their allow permissions, and then a deny would override the allow, unless it was explicit, in which case it could be different. So the model was very complicated, and enterprises got themselves into a lot of trouble because they were allowed to deny, so they got really sloppy, and they sort of gave everyone permission up high, and then they started taking people out down below. That's not a least privileged, secure way of doing it. And SharePoint doesn't allow you to do that. With SharePoint, you have to be very specific about what you're allowing people, which is the more secure management model for security. Now, that's at the permissions within the content itself. Now, there's another place where you can apply security in SharePoint, and that is at the web application level. So what we've been doing so far is from the top level site down in a site collection, but the web application itself also has a type of security called web application policy. And web application policy does, in fact, allow you to deny a permission. So let's take a look at web application policy and talk through some examples of why you might use it. In central administration, we can go to manage web applications, and we can take our team site web app, which is the web app we've been working in, and we can look at the policies associated with this web app. Now, if we go into user policy, which is one of the policies associated with the web app, we can see some of the existing policies that are in place here. So one of the existing policies that's in place here is that the search crawl account has full read permission to the web application. That is done by default. When you create a web application, SharePoint gives your crawl account full read permission as part of app policy. Now, the way policy works is web application policy overrides any permissions in the web application. So this means by allowing the crawler read permission at the web app level, we never have to worry about giving it permissions below. It has policy at the web app level that gives it full read permission of the entire web app. We can see other examples here of like the local service account, which has a read permission. We have this, which is a custom permission I created. I'll explain this to you, which is full control. And so one of the other scenarios you might use policy for is to allow a service to have full access to content. The service might have something to do with malware protection or auditing or some other enterprise content-related function. And so we've created a user account in Active Directory called sp_full_policy. And when we create web apps, we manually grant that account full control policy. So this is what it would look like. I'm going to remove it and re-add it here. So that wouldn't be there by default. So I'm going to remove some of these things that wouldn't be there by default. And we're going to grant, oh, by the way, before I do this, this is one of my small annoyances with the interface. In SharePoint, it's quite often, it'll say something like add users, when of course what you really want to be doing is adding groups. But unfortunately, it just says add users. And we can pick to grant a user or group a specific policy. And notice the policies that are here. We're going to do full control. So that's how we grant the policy. It's simple enough. And let me go back into that interface one more time and show you something here. Let's talk through the existing policies. Now, these policies also existed in SharePoint 2007. So far, this isn't necessarily new. Full control would be something like a auditing or malware protection kind of function. Full read, obviously very useful for indexing. Also could be done for read-only auditing. And then we have a couple of deny scenarios. Deny write is an interesting one. Deny write is a policy, and remember, policy overrides all permissions in the web application. So it means that regardless of what permission you have down here to a document, you will not be able to write it. You could have full control of the document. You're not going to be able to write it, to change it, because your deny write policy is applying. And so you might use that, for example, in a scenario where you want to lock the content of a web application without actually changing permissions. Now, if you think about a scenario where that might be necessary, think about something where maybe there's been a security incident and you're going to need to remediate that data and really examine it. You don't want to go and change permissions because that will actually change the data in the content database. But you can change the policy at the web application to deny a write or even deny full control. You might also have a group that you want to deny certain permissions to, even if those users are members of other groups. So for example, this is our marketing team site. The marketing members have all kinds of contribute permissions, but maybe we don't want our interns to delete anything. So we can put our interns into a policy that denies them the ability to delete, even though they might have contribute permission within the environment. Now in this interface, we don't see deny delete, we just see deny write. And this is the thing that's new in SharePoint 2010. In SharePoint 2010, you can actually define more permission policies than the 4 that came with 2007. So you can create a policy level like deny delete. So I'm going to create a policy level called deny delete, and I'm going to deny delete items. Click Save. And now, when I go to my user policy for that web application, I can now, let's create an interns group real quick. I can now grant to interns, deny delete. So now if a user is both in the marketing group and in the interns group, they'll have contribute from marketing, but they won't be able to delete. Questions so far on that? Okay. There was one more note I wanted to make on policy. Oh, the final note on policy is that I've been talking about policy as if it's associated with the web application, but it's not exactly associated with the web application. Policy is actually associated with the zone. Now, zones are something that a lot of people haven't quite gotten their head around with SharePoint. They can be very complicated. They can be really messed up in an organization. But a zone you can think of as a gateway into the web application. So the web application is all of the content that's in all the site collections. And a zone is a gateway, a doorway through which you can get to that content. Every web application has one zone by default called the default zone. And that's the URL that you're used to with your web application. So when you type a URL and you say, oh, I'm going to my web application, you're actually going to the zone of the web application. Now, a web application can have more than one zone. And you do that by extending the web application. And I think I've got one that has multiple zones. Let's check here. Let me get my glasses back on. No, I don't. So we'll have to just talk through it. You can create a zone by extending a web application. And when you extend a web application, you're basically prompted for the URL, whether you're using SSL, things like that. You're basically creating a new URL for that same web application. And so we might create a site, an internal site, where we post content to share with clients. We can extend that into a zone called extranet.contoso.com. So the new zone has a different URL, extranet.contoso.com, but it accesses the same content that we get to with clients.contoso.com from inside the network. As soon as you have more than one zone, you can apply different policies to the different zones. So notice when I go to my user policy to add a new policy, I actually get to pick the zone. So the idea is you can actually say that if you are coming from this direction, you get a certain set of permissions. Maybe you have normal permissions. But if you're coming from this zone, we're going to deny you certain permissions. And I'll give you a scenario where that's useful. We've had situations where an organization wants to allow users to collaborate. And when they're inside the office, they're allowed to do anything that they have permissions to do. But if they're coming in from outside the office, we don't want them to actually change anything. And the sort of scenario that leads to that is, they're concerned about, a user going and doing a bunch of damage to their data and then not coming back to work the next day, basically. So there are situations where from outside we want the data to be read-only, from inside we want you to be able to change the data. That can be done with policy. The permission gives you the right to change the data, but the policy, when you're coming in from the outside, denies you right permission. So those are a couple of interesting scenarios. There's a lot of others where web application policy can be a nice piece of the story for you. Any other questions at this point? Is it making sense? Okay. All right. We've talked about the default groups, owners, visitors, members, and we've talked about the fact that you can create your own custom groups. There's one other bullet point here that I want to address, which is what's called the default members group. This is a nice thing to know about in SharePoint, and it's something that's very poorly documented and understood and designed, in my opinion. The marketing members group, if we look at that group's settings, is currently the default group. And in SharePoint 2010, it's called the default group. In SharePoint 2007, it's called the members group. Now, what this means is if a group is the default group and there can only be one for the site, then if a user is in that group, links to this site will appear in Microsoft Office clients, in their My Site, and places like that. So let me make sure I've done my demo in a way that makes sense here. 1 second. Yeah. So if I go to my Site, hopefully my user profile application is working. You know how those can be. Make sure that I'm signing on as the right account. Yes. Sorry, I forgot to wake up my people application before the session here. So this is the first time it's being accessed. So it's going to take a few minutes to spin up here, or a few seconds anyway. Okay, we're not seeing it quite yet, but we're seeing some of the links that are coming from some of my other sites. So let's go and look at one of those sites here. Let's look at the consulting site. So these links that are showing up here are called personalization site links. They're maintained by the user profile application, and they associate a user profile with specific sites in SharePoint. So this one should be coming from the default group. Let's take a look. Yeah, so my membership in this default group of the consulting site is what's creating the link on my site, and then the Office clients consume this information. So when I go to File Open or File Save in Office, I will see links to the consulting site in two places. I'll see them in the dialog box. When you go to File Open, File Save, and you look in the tree, there will actually be a node called My SharePoint Sites or SharePoint Sites that expands and gives you easy links into these sites. Or in the backstage of Office 2010, you'll see the links there as well. So let's take a quick look at what I mean by the backstage. So in Office 2010, when you go to File, Save and Send, and Save to SharePoint, those links will actually populate in this portion in the right-hand side of the dialog box. So they're ways of helping users get to places much faster. They're very, very useful kinds of links. So just to summarize one more time, these personalization site links come, among other things, from your membership in whatever is the default group of your site. And the default group, by default, is the members group. Now that actually leads to a challenge. And here's the problem with this. The members group is being used for two things. It's being used to give you contribute permission, and it's being used to give you a personalization site link because it's the default group. Now, what if Dan is given full control to this site? So he's put into the owners group. Dan doesn't get a membership link for being in the owners group. It's kind of weird. He has to be in the members group, the default group, to get a navigation link, even though he has full control. And sometimes you want to tease apart those two jobs and really be able to decide who should get a link to this site, regardless of what permission they have. Maybe they only have read permission, but you want a link. And the contribute permission. So one of my pieces of guidance for companies is when you're setting up a team site, particularly because users need to get to team sites regularly. When you set up a team site, create a custom group that will be used to decide who gets an automatic link to the site. So create a new group, and I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. We'll create a group called, we're on the consulting site here, Consulting Navigation Link. Now, the name is a little extreme, but you get the idea. We give the group a name. It doesn't get any real permissions to the site because it's not about permissions. It's about, the name is already in use? This must have come from a previous demo. Let's see what's going on here. Site settings. People in groups. Oh, sure enough, it does already exist. This is from a previous demo. So create a group and then set that group as the default group. And then when a user needs access to the site and you want them to have a link, you put them in this group. And then you also put them in members or owners or visitors or whatever the other site is that actually gives them the permission you want them to have in this environment. And then you can take advantage of the links and the permissions separately. So that's sort of the bottom line there. And let's go back to the slideshow. Any questions on that point? All right. So now we've got an understanding of groups, we've got an understanding of permissions. Let's put these things together and start talking about how we can more effectively manage users and groups and permissions in our world, and get to the point where hopefully we can automate management of users and groups. So the first point is looking at some of the easy things that SharePoint allows us to do to manage groups out of the box. Let's jump back to our virtual machine. So we were on the marketing side. I'm going to go back to the marketing side now. And if we go into our people and groups, and we look at our groups that are available for us, we've got our different levels of permissions in this site. We might, as an organization, as an IT organization, want to empower the marketing organization to manage their own groups. Because in many organizations, in many enterprises, what happens is if an employee needs to get access to this site, the employee calls the help desk. And the employee says, I think I should have access to the marketing site. And then the help desk calls the marketing manager and says, should this user have access to the site? And the marketing manager says yes. And the help desk then puts the user in the site. It would be much easier if the user could just talk to the marketing manager directly without IT getting involved, and the manager could just take care of it. In many situations, we do want to delegate that responsibility. The basic steps for doing that are involved with the properties of the group itself. When you look at the properties of a group, you can see two important settings here, which is who owns the group and who can edit membership of the group. So we can leverage this to our advantage, and we can allow and if someone should be able to manage the membership of this group, we just put them in the marketing owners group. So far, so good? All right. But the problem with marketing owners is it gives them full control, which may not be appropriate. So once again, we should probably create a custom group that is responsible for managing groups in this site. So we create a new group. We'll call it Team Site Group Managers. Actually, we'll call it Marketing Team Site Group Managers. Again, it doesn't need any specific permissions, and we click Create. And we'll add the marketing manager into this group, who's Linda Mitchell. So now Linda is in the group called Marketing Team Site Group Managers, and then we go to our other groups, like our Team Site Members, and we make the Marketing Team Site Group Managers the owner, and allow the owner to edit the membership of the group. So now Linda, who's in that group, will be able to modify the membership of the members group, and we do the same for visitors and owners and everything else. So Linda, regardless of what permission she has, can now do the job of managing that group membership. Now there's one more step we can take to make everyone's lives easier, and that is we can allow requests to join and leave the group. So down at the bottom of the group settings, we have the ability to allow requests, and once we set allow requests, we can even choose to auto accept the request, meaning if you ask, you're in. Think about where that might be useful. Remember there's the group that says, give me a navigation link, and we make it the default group. That group doesn't have any permissions, it's just the default group, and if you're in it, you get a link. That might make sense to auto accept requests for. So if a user wants a link, they just add themselves to that group and wait 15 minutes for the user profile application to refresh, and all of a sudden they start getting links to that, and IT hasn't had to be involved at all. And then finally at the bottom, we get to send membership requests to a specific address, and this address should generally match the group owner's address. So if it's a marketing manager's group, we should probably send this to the marketing manager's group mailbox or something appropriate for the requests. Now, if we do allow requests to join and leave the group, we should take one final look and see how that's actually done. So we've just allowed the ability to get to that, to add request to join that group. Let's take a look at how it would look if we're logged on as a user without permissions. So I'm going to sign in as, let's pick a user. Andrew Dixon. So Andrew Dixon does not have permission to the site. And he can request access to the site, but this is not the same as requesting access to a specific group. In order to get to the acceptance, the user has to get into the properties of the group itself. So this is a kind of a strange thing. The user has to be able to get into the group list in order to request access. So in other words, Andrew Dixon would have to type this long, crazy URL to the specific group. Now this isn't working, why not? Maybe I didn't click OK. Oh, geez. Okay, so in order to save time, I'm just going to describe what's happening here. The bottom line is for a user to request access, they have to get actually into the group list, which if they don't have access to the site, they're not going to have access to the list. So what you can do as an alternative is copy the hyperlink into the group itself and post that hyperlink somewhere that users can get to. So there's basically a page where users can go and say, I want access to this and this and this. And when they click a link, they're actually going to the specific page for the group where then they will see an option to request access there. So my demo kind of broke there, but that's the idea. And let me back out of these and sign in as an appropriate user. Actually, let's just start a new instance. All right. So what we were talking about here were all documented on the slide. It's about enabling hierarchical group management, meaning one group can manage another, and enabling access requests. So that is one way to make group management easier. SharePoint has these workflow-like capabilities where a business user can actually manage membership of their group. Wouldn't it be nice if Active Directory actually had this kind of thing built in, where if a user wanted to join a group, they could click something and it would send an email to the manager and they could allow it? That'd be really nice, but Active Directory doesn't. You would have to use Forefront Identity Lifecycle Manager to get that kind of capability. So SharePoint actually has some pretty nice group management capabilities. And if we look at the differences between Active Directory managing groups and SharePoint Active Directory and SharePoint managing groups, there are some significant differences. With Active Directory, if you want to manage a group, you're going to use a fairly technical-looking interface out of the box. Active Directory users and computers, for example. There's no real provisioning where a user can request and then there can be a workflow and then they can be added to a group. It's fairly difficult to delegate group management, unlike what we just saw in SharePoint. But in Active Directory, when you add a user to a group, that group can actually have permissions not just to SharePoint, but to an Exchange mailbox, to a file share, and to other resources. So Active Directory has a big benefit in the world, which is it can centrally manage identities and groups for your entire enterprise. SharePoint, on the other hand, is easy. It's a non-technical interface. It's very clear to how you manage groups there. It's easy to delegate. You've got the ability of provisioning membership requests. So all of these things make SharePoint an attractive way of managing groups. So you've got two ways to manage groups. Some guidance as far as what you should actually do. Let's start with when you assign permissions. When you are actually assigning permissions in SharePoint, you can assign permissions directly to an Active Directory group. So we could take a document library and we could assign permissions directly to an Active Directory group. But that's not a good idea because that assumes that forever you're only going to use Active Directory for authentication. And as the world is changing, I can almost guarantee that won't stay the same for you forever. It's better to have a SharePoint group that has permissions to the library, and in that SharePoint group, maybe you nest an Active Directory group. But what that allows for you to do later is to take other types of identities and put them into that SharePoint group, like a group from Windows Live ID or OpenAuth or Facebook or any other Active Directory federated services, any other sort of identity provider that you choose to use down the road. You're able to add those to your infrastructure without having to go and change the actual permissions on your resources. All you have to do is add the new identities to the existing groups. So I don't recommend assigning permissions directly to Active Directory, but you do have the option of nesting Active Directory groups into SharePoint groups. So if we go back and look at our marketing team site, where's my VM? If we go into our groups, like marketing members, we could, if we wanted to, add the marketing group from Active Directory, Contoso /marketing. So now we've added that group. Let me show it to you in Active Directory so you know it's there. This group contains these 7 or 8 users. And now, because those users are in the marketing group and the marketing group is in the members group, all of the marketing members in Active Directory have contribute permission to SharePoint. So it's a simple concept. It's easy to do. And now, in the future, we can add additional types of identities into this members group and thereby grant those identities contribute permission. But the question is whether this is really a good idea or not. What are the pros and cons of managing groups with Active Directory? Well, the advantages are it's centralized. Now when you hire a new marketing person, you add them to the marketing group in Active Directory and they get permission to SharePoint. And they get permission to the file share that marketing has. And they have permission to the mailbox that marketing has. So that centralized management is a very, very big plus. And that's why a lot of organizations want to use Active Directory to manage their groups. Also, when a user leaves the organization, you take them out of marketing. They're instantly, they no longer have permissions to the resources they had in SharePoint. So all that's good. What are the bad sides of it? Well, the disadvantages of nesting Active Directory groups into SharePoint groups is what you're seeing on the screen right now. If I'm the business owner of marketing content and I want to see who has permission, I can't tell. I see a group name. That means I have to go call the help desk and say, who's currently in the Active Directory marketing group? So there's no visibility to who actually has permissions to the resources in the site. In addition, if a user is not in the site and they're just in the site through a group, if a user that is not in a site, there are certain collaborative functionalities that don't work. For example, you can set up people picker controls to show only the users in a site collection, and it won't show the user because the user is not in the site collection, only the group is. So there's times when the visibility becomes a problem if the user account itself is not in the group. So, what are the recommendations? Well, the recommendations are based on your governance plan. And you really do need to look at your requirements to know what's going on, but I'll give you some broad recommendations. And I'm going to change this slide real quick. Somehow my builds all got lost. Let's add a build back in. In an ideal world, what would be great would be that I could add a user to a group in Active Directory, and the same user would get added to a specific group in SharePoint. That way, I still get the centralized management of Active Directory, but I have the user in the group in SharePoint, which means they're fully visible and able to leverage functionality fully. That would be ideal, but it's not out-of-box behavior. On a large intranet site, let's say you've got your employee-wide intranet, and it's for 10,000 employees, I would certainly not put all 10,000 employees in the members group of your intranet. That would be kind of crazy. Instead, I would put the domain users group in there, for example. So in a large site where all you really care about is permissions, nesting a group from Active Directory into the SharePoint group makes a lot of sense. In a really small group, in a really small site like a team or a project, That's where it's going to be more important that the business users can see each other and know who has access to that site. So in the really small site, it actually makes sense to put each individual user in the group. So on a big site, nest. In a small site, don't. And somewhere in between, based on your pain of centralized management versus visibility, you can decide what the right solution is. So it's not a simple answer because there's no easy out-of-box way to solve the problem. Any questions about that? Yeah.
Yeah, when we have collaboration websites which are extranet,
Mm-hmm.
how could we give the possibility to the business to create user, but for people that are not in the Active Directory?
Good question. So the question is, on an extranet scenario, how do you provide accounts for users that aren't part of your Active Directory?
Yeah, but delegate this to the business owner of that.
Yeah, and then delegate the ability to create accounts to a business owner. So I as a consultant, can create an account for my customer. Yep. There's no out-of-box way to do that, unfortunately. It all depends first and foremost on what authentication provider you're using. So in an extranet scenario, you probably don't want to put users in your Active Directory. Instead, you want to keep them isolated. So you can use SQL to do that, or you can use Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, ADLDS, which is very well suited for that kind of thing. And if you use those tools, you have to get a front end to do user account management. And there are some third-party tools out there specifically for that. One of them is called Extranet Collaboration Manager, for example. So there are tools that do extranet user management. One of the things I would very closely look at today, if I'm going to do an extranet, is I would look at how easy is it for me to expose my extranet or to integrate my extranet with Facebook, Windows Live ID, Google, and other already existing authentication sources? Because that becomes an even easier thing to manage, because then the customer creates their own account, tells me what their account name is, and all I have to do is give it permission. And there's sample code on MSDN. There's also, I think, projects on Codeplex for this. So if that kind of authentication is acceptable to you, to use Facebook or Windows Live ID or something, I would go for that. And as you probably know, that's what Microsoft is doing with Office 365 in many cases. So it's definitely a good, secure way of doing it, as long as you trust the customer to maintain their own account. Other questions? Yeah. Yes, that's correct. Good point. If you nest a group into a group that is the default group, the users don't get the personalization links. The actual user account has to be in the default group to get that personalization link. That's absolutely true. There's also a few funky things that can happen. If there's too deep nesting, or if you've got some circular nesting that goes through distribution groups, you can actually break the membership and not get the access that you think you should have. So the bottom line is, the centralized management of Active Directory is nice, and when it works, it's great, but it's not always the right answer. Now, as I mentioned, the ideal world is to have something that synchronizes the two. And it's not available out of box, but it's going to be available for you today here, which is a good thing. So we're going to actually build the ideal world for us here. We got 15 minutes to do it, so that's just about right. So as those of you who were at my earlier session know, I had a major crash today, and I had to rebuild a whole bunch of stuff. But I'm pretty sure this is working, so we're going to be in good shape. I had rebuilt it during the break. So the idea here is we are going to set it up so that we can centrally manage group membership by using Active Directory. So that when we add and remove users, we do it in Active Directory. But instead of nesting that group into our SharePoint group, we're going to synchronize the membership, so that we get all the advantages of centralized management in Active Directory and all the advantages of direct user membership in SharePoint. So I'll try it with the marketing group. I tested it with a different group earlier, so if marketing fails, we'll use my test group. And we'll use the same site we've been working on here, which is marketing. And let's assume that our goal is for the marketing members group to have the same members as the marketing group in Active Directory. So I'm going to start by removing our existing members in here. So we have an empty group. Actually, I'm going to leave Dan in there. Now, in order to synchronize our group memberships, we are going to basically look at the membership in Active Directory, compare it to the membership in SharePoint, and make any changes that are necessary. So Active Directory is the master group. And so if a user is in Active Directory but isn't in SharePoint, we add them. If a user is in SharePoint but not in Active Directory, we remove them from SharePoint. And in order to do that, we're going to need a couple of commands available to us. Some of the commands come from SharePoint, and some of them come from the Active Directory PowerShell commandlets. So I'm going to load that module. And so I'm going to have to assume you have a little bit of understanding of PowerShell. If you don't, relax, because you can take the scripts and dissect them after the class. But there's a little bit of PowerShell knowledge necessary here. And it starts with the idea that the website contains a bag of groups that belong to that site. So we can grab the website, and then we can look at what groups that website has. And inside each group, we can look at the users that belong to that group. So let me show you how that would work. If we've got a website, which is Teams Marketing, we can grab that website. Oops, that's a good start. I think there's a permissions thing. Team. Oh, departments. Thank you. Yeah. I see what you're saying. It is departments. So we grab that website, and then in that website, there's a property called Site Groups. And the Site Groups has all of the groups that are there. And so just to make that list easier to look at here, we're going to look at the Site Groups, and we're going to select only the name. So those are the groups that we have available to us. And then we can pick one group. Let's pick, so out of those groups, we're going to pick marketing members. So a group, the web is the website. Site Groups is a property that contains all of the groups. It's you can think of it as a collection or an array. And if we want just one group, we put in square brackets the name of the group, in this case, marketing members. So we're grabbing that one group, and we're assigning it to a variable called group. And now that group has a property called users that is all of the users who belong in that group. So we can expose that list of users. So we get the web, we grab the site groups, we go into the users, the specific group we want, and we go into the users property of that group. So that's the list of a group in SharePoint. Active Directory is kind of similar. We can grab a group in Active Directory using the get AD group command, and we'll grab marketing. Now, the Active Directory groups, you work with them just slightly differently. You use a get AD group member commandlet, to expose the members of the group. And just to make that easier to read, we'll select only the name. So we can look at who's in the group in Active Directory. So we've got the ability to access the two member lists. And now the challenge will just be comparing them and making changes to them. Now, this is actually a little bit trickier than I wish it were. So I'm going to show you the script, and then we'll move on from there. And I'll tell you what the problem is. The problem is that the properties that are brought back from the Active Directory group, if you look at the users that are there, there is the user, the SAM account name, which is the logon name for the user, but that looks different than what we have from our SharePoint group users, which is the user login property, which has a contoso \. So the thing that we don't have any two properties that are exactly the same between the two lists, which makes them a little bit hard to compare. Now you can attack that several ways. We could say, all right, we know that in our Active Directory, the SAM account name, if we add Contoso / to it, it will be equivalent to the user login name in SharePoint. Or in SharePoint, we take off the Contoso / and it becomes the same as the SAM account name in Active Directory. So we could do some string manipulation, or we can find one property that's the same. And both lists do, in fact, use the SID. So the SID is brought back by Active Directory, and the security identifier is brought back by SharePoint. So that's something we can actually compare. Now, with that in mind, let me sort of step you through what this script does, and we'll change it for marketing here. So starting off at the top of the script, we have a couple of key variables. We have the website that we're working with, the SharePoint group, and the Active Directory group. So we're defining those groups. We're then making sure that we've got all of the code we need to run the scripts live. So we're importing all the appropriate PowerShell commandlets. Then we're doing what I showed you, which is we're grabbing a hold of the SharePoint group. But what we're doing a little bit different is we're taking that group and creating a new list that contains the SID and the user login name. So rather than all the properties, we're just taking those two properties and creating a list of SharePoint group members. We're doing the same thing on the Active Directory side. We're grabbing a hold of the group, we're getting its members, and then we're creating a list that contains the SID and the SAM account name that's coming from Active Directory. So now we have a simple two-column list of users from SharePoint, which is the SID and the user logon name, and a simple two-column list from Active Directory, which is the SID and the SAM account name. And then there's a really nifty PowerShell commandlet called compare object. And what compare object does is it looks for differences between the two lists. It's like the old diff command in Linux or even the Windows Resource Kit. So it's able to take these two lists and say, wow, these things are all the same, but this is different over here and this is different over here. And it produces an array that comes out with little arrows that say something is on one side or something is on the other. And we can use that array to say, wow, if compare object says this, that means we have to remove, that means the user exists in Active Directory, but, exists in SharePoint, but not Active Directory, so we then need to remove the user from SharePoint. If compare object comes back with this, it means the user is in Active Directory, but not in SharePoint, so it means we need to add the user to SharePoint. So that's what's going on in this script. Now, even if you're not a PowerShell person, you can use this script. I promise you, you can go back, because the only thing you have to change is the URL, the SharePoint group name, and the Active Directory group name. Everything else is standard, generic PowerShell, and it will work in any environment. So it's just those three variables that matter. Now, assuming I made my changes correctly and the gods of live demonstration are with me, which isn't always guaranteed, we should be able to switch to our scripts directory and run group sync. Oh, that's okay. But then the second one isn't. Oh yeah, that's all good. So the error we got is because it is adding the SharePoint module snap-in and it's already loaded. But it actually did the job. So notice Dan, who was in the group in SharePoint but wasn't in the Active Directory group, is getting removed, and all of the users who are in the Active Directory group are getting added into SharePoint. So let's see if it actually did the job. If I refresh this page, sure enough, there's all my users. So we've got the ability to tap into the two groups, compare them fairly efficiently, and make the changes that are necessary to keep those things synchronized. Now, for those of you who were in the session earlier today, you'll recognize what we're going to do next, which is we're going to create a SharePoint list where we list all the groups we're trying to synchronize, and then we're going to tap into that list from our script, and we're going to run the script as a scheduled task. So that all we have to do is create a database of what should be paired, and then we're able to run that as a scheduled task. So let's give that a try. I know we're running short on time, but I think we can get this done in time. Let me take a quick look. Oh, yeah, I've got 5 minutes. I think we can do it. So I have created in my SharePoint environment a site which is called sharepoint.contoso.com. And this is something I recommend, by the way, that I haven't talked about yet today, and that is have a SharePoint site about SharePoint in your environment. It is your SharePoint portal of SharePoint. And it's where people go to get training. It's where they go to report bugs. It's where they go to make requests. And it's where administrators go to track what's going on. So this would be your configuration and management database. So on this SharePoint site of SharePoints, I've got a list called Group Sync. And Group Sync is where administrators will go to specify for a specific website, what Active Directory group and SharePoint group it needs to be paired up. So we're going to go ahead and specify that for our marketing team site, which is at teams.contoso.com, departments, marketing, the SharePoint group called marketing members and the Active Directory group called marketing needs to be kept in sync. So we register that. And now I have a different script, Group Sync version 2, that will run, and if we're lucky, it'll work. Now it's going to give one error. It worked, all right. It's giving me the error again because it's trying to load a snap-in that's already there, which is fine. And it looks like it worked. Now it didn't make any changes because there weren't any changes to make. So let's say that we hire a new marketing person. We hire a new marketing person, so in Active Directory, we add Linda Miller. Whoops. Linda M. The next time this script runs, it adds her. And we go back to our site to confirm that. I've now denied myself access. How about that? I guess I wasn't a site collection administrator, huh? Luckily, I can just add myself back in. Boy, if this isn't a proof that the demo works, I don't know what is. Let's run the script again. Oh. Why is that doing that? Add Contoso SP admin. Okay, there we go. Just had to refresh. So, wow, that threw me off. So we go in and we look at our marketing members, and I really wanted to show that Linda Miller's there, and I picked her because she's got a picture, and it happens to be Angelina Jolie. So we now are seeing that this is working. We're registering the groups that we want to sync. The script, which I will give you, is doing all the dirty work. And let me show you the small difference in this script. The small difference in this script is that rather than hardwiring all the variables, the only thing you have to specify is the name, is where your list is being stored, what's it called, and then you have to specify the column names that you used in the list for the Active Directory group, the SharePoint group, and the URL. And one other thing that this is doing is it's registering the update activity. So when we go back and look at our group sync page, we can see that it last synchronized at this time. So now the final step with this is we register this as a scheduled task. So in our Windows task scheduler, we run PowerShell.exe. We point to the script that we've got, which is version 2 now. And we set that task to trigger at a certain time and to run every 1 minute is a little extreme, but we'll, we wouldn't do that in the real world, but we'll do it for now. Date. And it is just 7, so we'll have it run at 7:01, and I'll ask you to stay for 1 extra minute. Actually, we can even do 7 o'clock and 30 seconds. So we set that scheduled task to run, and we'll watch, and hopefully it will do the job for us. And just to prove that it's working, let's make a quick change to our Active Directory. Let's fire Linda. Oh, if I can do it fast enough. Oops. No, it didn't run, but whoops, why didn't it run? Oh, it's disabled. All right, so we'll just force it to run. There we go. And so we have that task running in the background, and our refresh works. So that does give us the best of all worlds. It gives us centralized management in Active Directory, synchronized visibility of users in SharePoint, and in this case, we treated Active Directory as the master. But think about why you might want to have other places where SharePoint's the master. Remember how easy it is for users to join a group in SharePoint and to ask a manager for access? Why not, in some situations where you have a group managing security to a file share, allow users to make the request in SharePoint to join a group, the manager approves it, and that change puts them in the group in Active Directory that gives them permission to the file share. So it's just a matter of flipping the switches around. Yes, we're finishing up right now. So that is the demo. Hopefully you enjoyed that, and it gives you some food for thought. I will be posting this and all of the other slides and scripts from the day at the same URL. So if you've got this already, you've got it. Otherwise, this is where it's at. Don't hesitate to write me if you've got questions. If you've got suggestions or modifications or improvements to the script, feel free. And tomorrow at 10:45, I'll be doing the business side of governance. It's not on the tech day schedule because it's part of the students to business days, but you'll find me and you can ask some people at the desk where the session's happening. Thank you guys for coming. Drive home safely and have a great night.